put it under the, the heater in your car, and just turn the heat on and just blast it, especially the last 15 minutes before you go. Keep that internal airspace in your camera. That's what you want to do. And a lot of the high-end pro lenses have got lots of water baffle sealing, but some of the lenses don't. So the less baffling, the less sealing there is, the more likely you are to get internal exposure. Or internal fogging. I'm gonna say this right off the bat, so don't forget. If your lens fogs internally, like in the center, not just on the lens cover, that lens is done probably, and it needs to come inside and warm up. Okay. So, but what we're trying to prevent is internal fogging. Your viewfinder can fog, your filters can fog. If the inside of your lens, the internal elements fog, then it probably needs warm, dry air to dry it out in most cases. Sometimes if you put it in your camera bag and walk around for a couple hours, it will defog, but not always. So that's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to try and help you prevent internal fogging in your camera. So start out with a warm camera, and if it's serious enough, you may even want to bring hot packs to strap around your camera. Okay? The other thing is to keep it dry. I'm just going to, let's see, maybe I'll upgrade. I'm going to go, this one was bigger. Okay. So, there's all kinds of dry bag options, and like this one's got a little all-weather pouch that's in the bottom that you can pull over. A big garbage bag works almost as well. A company called Dry Bag makes, and there's a few versions of these, makes these little roll-up vinyl bags, rubber vinyl bags, and they're great. And they can be great for, this is just a small one for your individual camera. But they make big ones with shoulder straps on. And so you can put them on and put your bag right in there. If you're going to get one that's a little oversized, because the best thing is, if you take it off, you can work in the dry bag like this with your camera bag in here. And if it's big enough, you can actually access your camera bag without having the rain coming down and holding an umbrella. So a dry bag can be really helpful. Just simply speaking, there are a lot of different camera covers out there and waterproof things. The ones that are breathable and have Gore-Tex, I like the best. I don't like any of them particularly. I find them totally finicky and fiddly. And they just drive me nuts. They get in my way. They don't transport that well. And a lot of them actually trap the heat of your hand. And if it's a cooler day and it's raining, just spinning your polarizing filter, the heat of your wet hand, that moist air rising over that cold lens, is enough to fog your camera. And if you're sitting there cleaning it and breathing on it at the same time, that's like the kiss of death. Seriously. So you've literally got to train yourself. Even when you're here, you're trying to breathe down, or out the side of your mouth. Because if you're breathing forward, you're just coating your camera and potentially the front with warm, moist air. And your breath is one of the killers of this. And so when you're working around the front of the camera, you hold your breath, because that's a guaranteed fog situation. And even wiping down the front of your lens with your warm hand can be enough to do it.
I think there's an invention to be there, Graham, the photographer's snorkel, right?
Yeah, I've done it already, darn it!
One of those bendable straws.
Gotta go patent this before this gets out.
Yeah.
Oh, darn! Denied. So I don't really like the different camera housings. Somebody may have one that works really well, and they're, I'm not saying don't get one, but I'm just not that keen on them. And so here's my answer. You know what? A plastic Safeway bag, and don't laugh, because this is what has kept me going. I've been using this for 15 years, so don't tell me there's something better, because I don't want to hear it. You know what? Just loop it around. You saw what I did there. Just looped it to the loop. And you know what? When this gets wet inside, toss it. Bring like 10 of them. Keep them in your car. Okay? Now it's off. Okay, I'm on the tripod. Throw it over. And it's on the tripod. Give it a little wrap around. And you got it covered. Okay? Then when I get to my tripod and I'm in a spot and it's got to come off, then at that point, I've got my umbrella. Okay? And I pop it open and it's a pain in the neck trying to work one-handed. And there are umbrella holders that you can get that are good, and some of them attached. You raise your center column on your tripod a little bit, and you can get an umbrella holder that will attach to that and hold your umbrella so your hands free. That's great. Again, for me, it's a little too finicky because I like to it's rare that I go to one spot and just park. I'm like, okay, I got to move a little bit. So I don't like things that. Hi there.
Quite trail.
That'll be $100. Hi guys. Sorry about that.
No, sorry. You're enjoying.
Yeah, we are. So, what was I saying? Umbrella. You know, it's a little bit finicky, but you know, you can just, when you're not working with the camera, you can literally put the umbrella over your camera on the tripod and just find it. It'll just find its way. It'll find a spot, and you can leave it and go into your camera bag. And so, even though one-handed, it's not great. For me personally, I like to work with that, and despite the shortcomings, because I like that better than an umbrella holder. But umbrella holders are available and good, and some people really like them. Not me. Okay? But this is my key. You know what? And once it gets wet inside, then you toss it. So then the other thing I've got, if it's going to be a really heavy day rain, I've got a couple of things. I've got a dry cotton cloth. Now, you probably all know about microfiber cloths, and they're great, and I love them. And, you know, lens tissue and lens fluid is great, but one thing is it adds moisture, so it's not really the ticket in a wet environment for starters, because it's going to be hard to dry your lens. But I generally use this for 95% of my cleaning, and as long as it's not gritty dirt that's on there, microfiber cloths are awesome. Fingerprints, anything oily, they just grab it and move it. Whenever you're cleaning your lens, you always start from the center and work to the outside, because it's the outside where the grit gathers. So if you start outside and work in, you're picking up all that dirt and grit, and that's the downside of using something like a microfiber or lens pen, is because you're dry cleaning and eventually you're gonna wear stuff off. So it's that toss-up between, you know, wearing your glass out and usually cleaning a filter, and the practicality of it, and how well this works. And I'll in a second. And so I prefer this, and eventually if I need to replace that polarizing filter because it's just worn and the coatings are worn, I do. But you know what? My polarizing filters last 5-6 years, and that's plenty. And that overrides the practicality. For me, working as a professional and needing to work quickly, practicality quite often overrides everything. And maybe laziness on my part too, because I find that if I have to fiddle with all this stuff to move, well, I don't move. And I want to feel like unhindered. So anything that I get to keep my gear dry, I want it to be mobile and easy and practical. So I'm always looking, there's different ways of doing all this stuff, and I'm always looking for the most practical, quick way. Because if you're doing this all day, you know, and maybe with a bit of a time pressure, like I might be on a shoot, and it's important to be able to move from place to place and get all the shots, I need to be practical. So let's say your camera's fogged, your front element's fogged, then what? Okay, the microfiber cloth is great when things are dry, but most of them are hydrophobic. Oh, you had a question.
Yep, just out of experience, before you use the microfiber cloth, to fill any dust or residue.
Yeah, oh for sure. Use a brush, and also give your cloth a shake. And if you don't have your blower, you know, brush it with your thing. Okay.
Do you know where you can get those in bulk?
I don't know. B&H Photo's got everything, and if anybody has it in bulk, they would. B&H Photo, by the way, out of New York, is just brilliant. They're, you know what? Every pro I know probably at some point or another has bought something from there, and so they're really good. And if you have any problems, they stand by what they do. And there's tons of, you know, online chat or on the phone help, and the guys that you talk to are pros, and so really good.
There's all kinds of microfiber cloths that you can buy at the grocery store, and they look perfect.
Okay. Yeah, I've got one that I use on my Mac, and so I don't know anything about them, so I'm not going to recommend them in case the fibers are made a different way. I know these are made for optics, and the grocery ones might work fine. I just don't know. So, anyways, these are usually hydrophobic, which means that they sort of repel water. They're great for grease and general dust, but in a wet situation, you're going to find that your microfiber cloth is really causing more problem than anything. This is what you use to finish the job when everything's dry, okay? And so you want to keep it dry. you know, you have a tendency to carry your microfiber cloth here, and I do in warm days, and I always have one in here, but I have like 3 or 4 of these, because the heat of your body is going to steam this up and it's going to be moist, okay, and that's not necessarily a good thing on a moist day. So your microfiber cloth, probably you want to keep in your camera bag. I still keep one here, you know, in a situation like this, fogging is not much of an issue, and if my microfiber cloth is a little damp from perspiration, I can give it a shake, and a little bit of moisture isn't bad, okay? So let's say the situation has gone from good to bad, and you've got water droplets on the front of your lens, or you've got fog. There's a whole series of things that you can do. Number one, carry a dry cotton cloth. It's quite absorbent, or even paper towels. Paper towels aren't great on optics, but they're not bad. And find the softest one you can get, and sop up the moisture. That's what you want to do. Your first step is to get the bulk of that moisture off your camera. And then you can touch it up a little more with a cotton cloth, and then blow it, you know. Air movement is the best thing. It's dry, and if you have your battery pack with your portable blow dryer, then you pull that out. Just kidding. But I could patent that too. But that warm, dry air blowing over the front of your camera is the best thing. In fact, if you go home and your camera's totally fogged and it's like, you know, you're worried about it, get a blow dryer on it. But be careful, because the blow dryer, I did this once. I left the, you know, I was busy and I was doing a bunch of other stuff. I left the blow dryer pointed right at my body, my camera body, and it melted it.
Anyway,
So, blow dryers get hot. Hi there. No problem, no worries. Right. So you want to get the front of it clean, and then work on it with the microfiber cloth, okay? And so the whole idea is to get it dry enough to use this on it, okay? And so I've got, before I go out, in every pocket, I've got 3 or 4 of these, either Ziplocs, or even better sometimes with the little, you know, the little sandwich baggies that you fold and flip. They're actually easier to get into sometimes in a Ziploc. And I'll have all my really soft paper towels in here, and I'll have 5 or 6 of them, because each time you go into this bag with wet, damp hands, you're adding moisture. Eventually that bag is useless and everything's wet in there. So I've got 4 or 5 of them sealed and in different pockets, and you know, hopefully I've got enough to last me today. So I take up the extra moisture with the paper towel and get it dry enough with a little fanning, then to use my microfiber cloth. Okay, so if that's not working, I've got multiple polarizing filters, and I might, in some cases, even take a UV filter if it looks like it's going to be a really rough day. Because that front filter is going to be your first line of defense. And if you have a UV filter over your polarizer, I don't like putting UVs on ever. But this is the one place where I might, because once that finally fogs, you can take it off. And then throw it in your pocket. It's going to steam like crazy in there, but if there's only one layer of glass, warm it up. The key is, the reason it's foggy in the first place is your glass is cold, and it's grabbing that moist air and it's precipitating on your lens. So warm that UV filter up, and now you work with your polarizing filter. They've got polarizing filters, you know, a polarizing filter is 2 sets of glass, you know, and there's slits. I won't describe how they're made, but basically they're 2 glass surfaces rotating. There's air in between, and that can steam, okay? But they've got other kinds of filters, Casement in particular, and they're very expensive, you know, $300-400 depending on your size, but Casement, and they're sealed, and so that internal air likely won't fog, and so it's worth spending a little bit of extra money if you think you're going to be in wet situations. I have those, and I have extra polarizers. Eventually, when that first polarizer fogs, I take it off, and if I can't get it clean anymore, I take it off, I put it in my pocket. It's going to steam, it's going to fog, but you're going to have a chance to warm it up and maybe clean it, maybe not. But you give it a shot. And then I put the other filter on. The other thing that's good, and I hate them, lens hoods are great because they keep the front of your camera dry, and they're also a bit of a barrier against breath. Okay, so they're sort of like a dead air space, and it really does help reduce moisture getting into your camera from your hand to your breath. And they also help stray drops. And if it's windy, you know, an umbrella, you know, if the wind's coming at an angle, it can be hard. If you're turning into the wind, it can be hard no matter what you're doing to keep your lens clear. So the best way is, if there's a breeze at all, that you work with it to your back. And that may not be the ideal for what you want to compose, but that may be the practicality of working in the rain and the wind. Because the wind adds another layer that's really difficult to deal with. So I think that's probably about it. And then if your lens does fog, then get it into the car if you can, if you're in a place where you can, and crank the heat on, and that'll dry it out. And if you come home and things are really wet, again, the blow dryer is a good option. You can even put it in a toaster oven or the oven. If you do this, you can heat your oven up and put an object, a metal object in there. Heat it up a little bit, turn it off, turn it off, turn it off, turn it off, turn it off.
Why?
I know this guy who didn't. Enough said. No, I did actually, and I caught it in time. Turn it off. Don't leave yourself a timer. Turn it off, okay? Reach in, pick up that metal object. If you can pick it up and not get burnt, it's okay. Put your camera in there and you can close the door and just let it sit, okay? So that's another option. But, you know, when you come in from a wet day shooting and things are fine, you may find that going into the car or going into your house will just steam your camera. And I think if you're there on Wednesday night, I talked about, you know, working in Whistler, it was freezing cold, minus whatever it was, and I walked into the big restaurant area, one of the big chalet restaurant areas, and you know, 200, 100 wet, damp, perspiring skiers, and like 5 steps in, I was just like coated with condensation. So when you're coming into a warm, moist environment, what you want to do is bundle your camera up, put it in the Ziploc, put it in your dry bag outside, and bring it in. And if you're bringing it into your house, bring it into a mud room, the coolest room you've got, and let it just acclimatize and let it warm up. Because if you bring it into a warm house with bodies in it, chances are it's gonna, you know, condense. And that's not necessarily the end of the world, but there's no point in doing that if you don't have to. Now, what about keeping your camera dry and versus it getting wet, and you know, how wet do you want to get it, and how comfortable are you getting wet? That, you know, that's all personal preference. I use my stuff, and most of the higher level bodies have got good O-ring and moisture sealing in them. Like my 5D Mark II is really a tank in the rain. I've never had it shut down ever in the rain, and it's been pretty wet. Now that said, some camera bodies may not stand up that well, or your body may not have gotten sealed as well at the factory. Who knows? But you know, I made a joke sort of the other night. I said, you know, if you're working out there and your gear's getting wet, you know, that's part of working in the rain. And you have to decide at what point do you baby the gear versus getting the shot, and that's, you know, that's just a decision you have to make. If one day your camera shuts down, as I said, you know, then you know, that's sort of what, that's how much your camera can take. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing. You're like, I just destroyed my camera. Probably not, okay? Most likely not. Now, don't take my word for it, but water usually is not a problem for cameras. It can short stuff out, but usually it's the ions from your sweat, the salt from the ocean. Salt is brutal. Sugar and coffee, brutal. Keep those things away from your electronics. You know, if you ever get a splash of salt water, I'm not saying that this is what you should do, but this is what I do. Let's say you get hit by a wave and you've got water in your shutter, you've got seawater in your shutter release. I get a mouthful, I get my water container and I dry suck it out and spit the salt out, and then I'll with my mouth, I'll put a little bit of fresh water in and suck it out. A little fresh water, suck it out. And then I've usually got some rubbing alcohol, and rubbing alcohol can be quite helpful for that, and I'll put a little drop in and shake it out. And the whole idea is you're trying to dissolve the ions that are in there and dilute them and pull them out. You know, so that's in a worst case scenario. Okay? So I think that's it. The key is to keep your camera warm. It's the cold of your glass that condenses the warm, moist air, and that's what causes fogging. And once you're internally fogged, switch lenses, or you're pretty much done, because it's unlikely, it's not impossible. You could put that lens back in the camera bag, and it may, over time, just acclimatize in the camera bag, especially if your bag is dry, and it may unfog. But it's potentially done for the day, and at the very least, switch lenses. Okay? So, any questions on all of that? Okay. All right. So let me just. Okay. So we're here, and I want to draw your attention to 2 trees. Now, there's 2 kind of different shots here that I want to work on, and the first one is the obvious one. This beautiful little creek, and you know, for something like this, I'd have my 17 to 24 mil, and I'd be trying to find a cool foreground. I'd be in here and watch it. These rocks, anything that's wet around a creek has a layer of algae on it, super, super slippery. But I'd be in here, I'd be looking for a foreground. And I'd be looking for something like this thing here. And bringing those leaves right into the shot, and then you've got a little cascading water, and you've got that big tree behind, and then you've got the issue of scale. You want to show how big that tree is, because the wide angle is going to minimize that. And that's where your foreground may help, because someone may recognize those leaves, those particular ferns, and say, oh, that's a very small leaf, but look at how big that tree is. Or you can put a person in the shot, backed off as far as you can, and still being able to see them. The further back the person can go, the bigger it's going to make that tree look. Now you may say that's kind of cheating, but you see already your wide angle lens is minimizing how big everything looks. And so things aren't looking the way that they really look. So by adding that person for scale, you're not really cheating. By having them go back 50 feet, you're not really cheating, but you're helping to give some perspective to your viewer. Because you have to ask yourself, why am I doing this shot? Am I doing it just because it's a beautiful artistic shot? Then maybe the size of the trees don't really matter. But if I'm doing that to actually capture the size of the trees, then you need to, in some way, show that perspective, okay? But I'm always looking for foreground. And so my first shot here would be my wide angle. In my case, it's a 17 mil, and I'm gonna shoot it at probably f16 or f22. And I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna get something right in my lens. And I'm gonna use something called hyperfocal distance. I'm not gonna describe today how to do it, but you can go online and find out the hyperfocal distance for your particular lens, like your focal length of your lens. If it's a 17, a 24, 28, at f22, at f16, it changes at each f-stop. But it's basically a way of finding out what is the closest thing to my lens that can be sharp and also have my background sharp. So the whole point of hyperfocal distance is maximizing your depth of field, okay? And finding out how close can I put something to that front of that lens and have it sharp, like technically sharp, and still have my background sharp, so that I'm sharp front to back, infinity to 6 inches from the lens. And your hyperfocal distance can help you figure that out. So you can actually get a scale, and it'll tell you at f22, if you focus at 8 inches from the lens, then everything 6 inches to infinity will be sharp. Because our first instinct sometimes is to focus on that foreground thing and get it razor sharp. But what you're doing is you're wasting some of your depth of field, because now you've got this fern this close to the lens and it's sharp, but it's so close now, and you focus so much on it that everything out here is not sharp, and you've wasted a bunch of sharp space in here. Because when you go to f22, you're actually going to have stuff right here that's going to be sharp, okay? So the idea is that rather than focusing on that fern being sharp, your hyperfocal distance gives you a distance from the lens to focus on. And let's say it's 8 or 9 inches. Now the fern is here, but you're actually focusing on this fern that's back here. And then when you go to f22, that zone of sharpness that you have at 2.8 gets wider and wider and wider and wider. And so you're trying to put that close limit right at that fern that's right in front of your camera. And you're trying to put that far limit to infinity so that everything's sharp. That's the point of hyperfocal distance. Maximizing that depth of field and not wasting it. Because our tendency is to focus on that fern that's right there, when really you're wasting all the sharp area in front of it. What you want to be focusing on is not this fern, but this one back here. And eventually, once you figure out the hyperfocal distance, the other way you can do it is you can take a tape measure and start it at 0 at your lens, and then have it go 24 feet out and have something that's big in the background that you can focus on at the end of it. And then do some math and do some testing and find out where you get your background stuff sharp and what you have to focus on the tape measure. Is it at 9 inches? Is it 11 inches? and figure out your own hyperfocal distance. But go online, I won't try and explain it further, I think you get the concept. It's trying to figure out where with your particular lens length, because it changes with your with the length of your lens. It's different for a 24 millimeter than it is for a 17, and it's different at f22 than it is for f16. So it varies based on length of lens and your aperture. Okay, so eventually you just get the hang of it. Right now it sounds like, oh, maybe it's like that's too technical for me. For me, I don't measure anything. I know that, you know, at f22, roughly about here with this lens, that's sharp, and I can shoot to about here, and everything's going to be sharp. And I just know that from experience. And eventually, if you do it enough, you will too. And you won't need to measure anything. You'll just eyeball it. Yep, that should be sharp. And you might just, for safety's sake, bracket it a little bit. You know, focus a little this way, a little that way, and you know, just to be sure. Okay. So.
Can I just, for some cameras, they have depth of field previews, right? Some
Yeah,
cameras
depth
have
of field previews aren't very useful, I find, because it's hard. You need technical sharpness, and even if you zoom in, and that's the other thing. I mean, you can go in with your viewfinder and zoom in, but you know, I don't think my viewfinder doesn't really have the resolution to tell me what I want to do, and it's also very finicky to do that, and you know, and to move it around, and that just stuff like that drives me nuts, personally. And it might work for you, and if it does, that's fine. I'm not saying it's a bad way, but depth of field previews can give a good idea. But if you need technical excellence, like I would, then you need to know exactly what you're doing, and so that's what I'm after. Okay, so yes.
There's a free app you can get for Android or the iPhone that'll show you exactly.
Yeah, and there's a free app, so you can go online and get free apps or a YouTube video, or there's scales, and there's lots of different ways to do this online. So look into it a little bit more online. So anyways, I would be looking at this scene in two ways. I'd be first thinking wide angle. Well, not first. Actually, my first shot would be my long telephoto. You know, and I probably can't get far enough away to use 200 mil, but I'm probably in the 80 to 120 range, and we'll get to that. We're going to go over there for that. But seeing as I'm right here, I'd be looking for a foreground. Now, you know, it's rare that you get a little tumbling creek next to a massive tree, like a real character tree like this. You know, like that's like the ethereal, perfect, you know, quintessential rainforest shot. Little tumbling creek, big tree. So I would look, you know, for some plants as a foreground, but also don't forget that creek. And so there's really quite a little tumbling little spot here. And you can come and look at it after, but it's almost too close to this tree. But it's a tumbling little punch bowl, and I might have that right in the lens. If we were here a few weeks ago, there was quite a bit of water coming down off this, and you might be able to shoot back there. But don't overlook these ferns. You know, have those ferns coming, you know, right into the camera. And even if they're not technically sharp, here's a nice pair, okay? So you're always looking for balance, and here's a nice staggered pair. And let's say you guys are the big tree, and I might have, forget the technical sharpness, I might allow that fern to come right into the lens, and most of it will be sharp, but the last part might not be. And I might even touch the fern, okay? But the whole point is to get this, you know, eventually still have your hyperfocal going on, still have your background sharp, but get that fern just pulling the viewer's eye into the scene. Use those strong lines to just point your viewer into the scene. And so that's the point of foreground for me. It's never just to have foreground for the sake of foreground, because, you know, sometimes people, like, you know, they'll just, okay, well, there's some foreground, and it's just sort of tangled and not very nice. If you're going to use foreground, realize even though it's in the bottom of your frame, it's prominent, it's close, it's what people can see. So make it artistic, make it something that's there for a reason, not just foreground for the sake of foreground, but have it either something that you want to look at, you're creating this sort of intimate portrait within a bigger landscape, so you're adding a layer to your landscape shot, or you're using that foreground, maybe it's got strong lines of some kind, and you're using that foreground to pull your viewer into the scene, okay? So it's either artistic, or it's something interesting, you're showing a context of where it lives, or you're using those strong lines, or maybe it's water. You know, that's why whenever I go into the rainforest, I've always got my chest waders or my hip boots. I've got them in the truck with me. because quite often where I want to be is not on the side of the creek. I want to be in the creek, and I want my camera down low, and you know, to the point where I've got the creek coming right in. And so I'm always looking for a strong foreground. Pool in the forest can be quite beautiful, but even you know, elsewhere, big mountains, whatever it is, that reflecting pool in the foreground can be your foreground that pulls your viewer's eye in and adds that next layer to your image. So, and again, the foreground isn't there just to be foreground, but it's got a purpose. You put it there for a reason, and you're trying to find something attractive. So there's all kinds of things that all kinds of foregrounds here. And be super careful on these rocks. They are, I'm telling you, they are deadly slippery. But something like this, you know, it's got that mossy texture. Maybe you use that to come in. Or maybe you come here, there's a little tumbling creek here. You probably can't see the tree for the creek. So maybe instead you back off and you use this fern and you can see the creek tumbling below. Or there's another fern over there. Or maybe you focus on the moss. But use stuff that brings another level to your image. Question down there.
Just wondering if you could talk a little
Really loud, because I've got the creek here.
Can you talk about your ISO?
Sure. ISO, the question is, mine's always at 100 and maybe 160. Why 160? I'm not a technical guy. Some might have picked this up already. You know, I'm not like the guy who can figure out f-stops, and I just don't even, you know. Somebody else was asking about, what do you call them? Histograms. Hate them. Hate them. Absolutely. I find them absolutely distracting. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't use them, but you know, for me to like take the shot and then look at this scientific data, it affects my mind, and I can't look at it. If you want to look at it, great. But you know what? My viewfinder is really good on this, and it looks very much like my Mac looks at home. If it looks good here, it looks good on the Mac, good enough. You know, and I'm not saying, I know a lot of guys who use histograms, and they're great photographers. It's not my thing. I find they're distracting. And for me, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get into a scene and think creatively, artistically. I don't want to be distracted with a lot of technical stuff. I'm technically proficient at getting exposures. I generally either use, with film, I always used a handheld light meter, because I just want to know how much light is there. I don't want to meter off a dark thing and then compensate and meter like 10 different things and average it all. That would drive me crazy too. Give me a handheld light meter, tell me how much light is there, independent of whether something's light or dark, how much light is falling on the scene. And then in my experience, I know, okay, this is fairly dark forest, it's absorbing a lot of light, I'm gonna have to open up a stop and a third. So I don't use histograms. And if you know, I can't believe I'm saying this, but in the digital world, you know, especially if you're not competent in getting exposure, it's not the end of the world. And you know what? It's free. And it used to be film. I used to never say this. You know, you should be the master of the light, and I still say this today. You should be setting your exposures based on what you want to see, not just taking shots and like, hey, that looks pretty good. You know, oh, I'll take 10 shots, one of them will look good. But you know what? Ultimately, it's about getting a great shot and enjoying what you're doing. And if figuring out exposures is getting in your way and it's stressing you, you know what? Take 10 shots. I cannot believe I'm telling you that, but take 10 shots. You know, look at your viewfinder. Hey, that's dark. Better lighten up, you know. Do that if you have to do that. If you're, you know, some of the best artists I know a couple of ladies, and they're technically absolutely challenged, and they have no clue on exposure, but they have great eyes, and they're artists, and they do beautiful work. Yes, they got to take 20 shots to get one good one, and it's all the same thing. But don't, you know what, if that's you, don't let that stop you. Don't let that, you know, if you're able to be technically proficient, then be, and that's good. But if you're not, don't let that spoil photography for you. You know, in the film days, it was like, yeah, you take 10 shots and you just spent $20, but not anymore. I still encourage you to learn exposure and, you know, use your histogram if you want all that. But because it's digital, if you can't get past that exposure part, you know, just let it go and work with it. Okay, so that's how I would work here. There's all kinds of stuff. And then in terms of people, then I have models that I hold at gunpoint, like my wife and children, and you know, I do a lot of tourism work, so quite often models are supplied. And then quite often I've got people up, you know, in a place like this, I'd have somebody, you know, bushwhack up there, and I'd find the spot, and they'd be holding still for 8 seconds, 15 seconds, you know, whatever it takes. And so that can help with scale. Now I want to, so the other thing is, you know, before you go out, I send an email out, always make sure you've cleaned your sensor. And there's lots of different ways to do it. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but if at all possible, blow your sensor clean. And if that's all you need to do, that's the best thing. And you can take a shot on a, you know, take a shot of your computer screen at white, and even move your camera around a little bit while you're doing it, and that will make sure that any spots you see aren't the screen. And then just pull your card out and load that shot and look and see if there's anything that's a problem. Okay? Then dust it off, blow it off. Okay, that's the first line of, don't touch your sensor if you don't have to. Do not just clean it for the sake of cleaning it. Most of the cameras have got built-in, well they all do now, have got built-in, you know, sensor cleaners, and they're really quite good. So, you know, use sensor cleaner fluid and all that physical touch stuff only if you need it. The next level of defense, I have a brush. It's an ionic brush. I can't remember who makes it. But no, it's not an Arctic butterfly, but that's apparently, I know guys who use that and they like it. But it's a brush, and it's got a charge part. It's got a charge to the hair, and it's very soft. And you just press it onto the sensor gently, and the brush just splays out into every corner, and you just give a gentle little swirl, and you take it out, and then you touch. It's got a little clip on it, a little wire and clip, and you demagnetize it, or you decharge it, and the dust just falls off. So that's a dry clean, and then go to fluid with swabs as a last resort. That's my routine. But the other thing is, when you're changing lenses, quite often I see people that got their cameras out and their lenses off and their body's open. You know what? When you're making it goes against my grain. Take this lens off first, and when you go to change lenses, point your camera down. Okay? You want this thing open as little as possible. Okay? Now my first thing is to want to put that cap back on the lens that I just took off, but don't. Keep it held down and hold it down. I'm sort of not doing this right, but and that minimizes, you know, just minimize that time. Any gravity, you know, gravity will pull anything that's falling down, hopefully. And so minimize your time open. That's just a simple thing of working in the field. You know, minimize your time your camera's open. Make sure it's pointed down. Make sure you get this covered before you get the end of this lens covered. This lens you can blow off easily. That sensor, much harder. Okay? So just a little practical thing. Now, again, I've got polarizers on in the forest, and if you've got one and you scan around here, you'll find that the effect is quite significant, and it really makes a difference. Yes, it adds a few stops of light, but that's sort of the cost of it. But to me, it is the secret of really getting a great polarizing shot. Now, I'm sitting here looking at this tree, and what I'm going to want is somebody, nobody has to go there, I'll go there, but somebody's going to be up in there, and now I'm going to want to be as far back from these guys as possible without getting any foreground in my way, okay? And I'm going to want to leave just a little opening, so I'm probably going to be right here. And this is a shot, you know, it's not often where you can shoot vertically, you know, in a forest and not have any background. The other thing that is absolutely great about these trees is they're against a hillside, right? So if you're on flat, level ground, if I was to shoot like this, at that angle, I'd be shooting up into the sky. Okay, so you'd start getting those highlights that you see up there. Totally distracting. Not the end of the world, and sometimes it happens, and sometimes it works. But generally, I like to keep those bright hot spots out because they are absolute distractions. Your eye is always drawn to the brightest spot, and so keep them out. So I can even go back further. I could probably go back to that spot back there. And the further you go back, the longer you can use this lens at. Okay, so right now for a vertical, you know, I'm like at 80. But I could go back here and probably be at 100. Now to go horizontal, I could probably be standing here, I'm at 80 again. But I could probably go back and get that longer, narrower angle, and it's gonna give a feeling of size. The further you can go back and the longer the telephoto, the more feeling of size you're gonna get. Then put your person in a fairly bright, you know, jacket or something in the background and have them move around in your frame and take the shot. And you know, this tree's got beautiful branches that come down, and that tree behind it is very character. The biggest problem with this scene is the foreground tree is quite dark, whereas the background tree is quite light. You could even use a split neutral density filter here if you wanted on its side, or you could even in Lightroom or Photoshop lighten this tree a little bit. But part of the reason this tree is lighter than that one is that it's a different tree and it's got different coverage. That has a very exposed side, so it's quite dry and scaly. But this side is quite covered and dark, so it's got a lot more moss and it hasn't been bleached as much. So they're just different trees. So anyways, this is really, you know, it doesn't get much better than this in terms of having trees, big trees side by side, because they're both beautiful trees, the sweeping branches, the curve of that one in the back, and one is sort of up from the other. There's a lot of character in this shot. It's very lush green. You've got a high back behind you, so no, hot spots. The foreground, or the stuff around the trees is not very tangled. It's quite clean looking. So quite often when you're in a forest, you come across a big tree, it's just surrounded by a tangle of brush, and you can't even get at it. And here you've got two side by side, and it's quite clean and quite artistic around it. It's got a real nice feel. So a set of trees like this is rare. It really is. And add that creek on that other tree, and it's quite rare. There's a place that I found up in the Ilaho Valley, and it's got a grove of cedars like this with a creek that's a bit bigger than that. And it's probably one of the best spots that I've ever found, aside from Carmana locally, where you can combine big trees and a nice clean landscape with a creek. Because it's so often you find big trees, but it's rare that you find a little tumbling creek like right in close proximity so you can put it in the frame. The whole rainforest has got a little bit of that. But this is really good, and if you were to come when that creek is going, like in the fall, this is very beautiful in the fall because the vine maples start to turn, and you've got a lot of color. And you know, right now, spring is great for the forest because it's green and it's lush. And I'm telling you right now, this is the peak of the forest in terms, if you want lush greenness, this is it right now. We're right in the peak of it. And if you look, even though we don't have, you know, we've got overcast, there is backlight coming, okay? And if you look around, you'll see that there's light coming through some of these ferns. And the backlight can come from an opening in the forest, or it can come from the sun punching through the clouds. But it gives a glow to the ferns. And you see these ferns back here, they're picking up some light through the opening that's behind those cedars, and it gives a delicate backlight. Add the polarizer to that, and it really, you know, they just jump out. So you come back here and try your polarizer on here, and look at these ferns just to the left of the big tree, and watch the reflections just disappear. And take a shot with polarized and unpolarized. And put it on your screen big, and you'll see a significant difference, and much richer green. Because it's not, you know, we see the ferns. The ferns are obvious. Oh yeah, those leaves just went from washed out gray, white to, you know, green. But the trees, every little algae has got reflecting surfaces, and it all in unison gets richer and greener with the polarizer. So, highly recommend it. So, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to run up there, and if you guys want to set up a few shots, or at the very least walk over and see what I'm talking about, I'm going to go and you guys can give me some direction about where to stand, and I'll show you what I mean. And then take a couple of shots, and even if a couple of people do it, and then share it with the others in the club. Now here's another no-no. I just walked away and left